We're going to try to bring in Tom Bennett from Scotland so he can be our featured speaker today. And while we're waiting for Tom to join us, I'd like to simply provide you with a brief introduction. You have a pretty thorough explanation of Tom Bennett right in front of you on the screen and in the program. But I'm going to relay a couple of personal anecdotes that explain how I came to know Tom Bennett. About 8 years ago, I was in Canada and I was in Newfoundland. And I was asked, Paul, you better get to New York City. So I said, well, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it because I have to go to Waterloo and give a talk at the Canadian History of Education Association. I could technically get to Manhattan on the Saturday because my session is in the morning on a Friday. So I flew from St. John's, Newfoundland to Toronto. I drove to Waterloo. I drove back to this airport in Toronto, and I flew to New York City to be at the first Research Ed conference in North America, and I haven't been the same since. Anyone who has met me over the last 5 or 6 years has said, my God, you've been awakened. You've actually found something that you can put your time and energy into. And one of the reasons is I met Tom Bennett and I came to realize what this was all about. Research Ed. It starts with teachers. It says that teaching matters and we need to have a teaching-centered school system. Now, if that isn't a challenge, and that means that we have to focus on doing what we can to improve teaching and learning, not only for teachers, but for parents and for the community. So we are all in it together, and I think you wouldn't be here today if you weren't motivated by that. I'm just totally honored that Tom gave me this pin right here. It's the ambassador's pin for Canada. And when I travel and go to Research Ed conferences, as I have, I was in London on September the 3rd, and there were 1,500 teachers and 152 speakers, and I was proud to be one of them. And it was just an incredible event. So what I'm going to say is thank you, Tom, for making this all possible, and we hope that you can join us. Oh my goodness, there he is. Over to Tom.
Wow, thank you very much, Paul. Well, there's quite a lot of echo here, but I hope you can hear me okay. I'm going to turn down my microphone a little bit there. Right, so what a pleasure, what an honour to be allowed to speak to you. Thank you so much to Paul, to the team, to the venue, to everyone else who's put this together. What a wonderful thing. I'm sorry I can't be with you. I'd love to be in Nova Scotia. I'm actually in Old Scotia right now, where it is predictably cold and windy and wet. And I actually had a stag walk through my garden this morning. If you can get any more cliched than that for Scotland. We saw haggis this morning outside, wild haggis. It's a pleasure to speak to you. And what I'd like to talk to you about is behaviour. So let me just cue up a little slide here. I hope this works. If it doesn't, it's going to be a long conversation. Right. Et voila. I hope you can see that. So what I'd like to talk to you today is about behaviour, because I'm the director and founder of Research Ed International, and my other cap is that in the UK, I am also the behaviour advisor for the Department for Education. So I advise the UK government on behaviour in schools. We've rewritten policies, we've created behaviour hubs to get schools together and so on. So we've done quite a lot nationally since 2015. I'm sometimes called the behaviour czar, which is unhelpful because I don't have any power. But it's great to be. I was a teacher when I started doing this, and it was great to project teacher voice into these institutions, which I think was much needed. I also wrote a report in 2017 called Creating a Culture, where I was asked by the Secretary of State for Education, what is it that the best schools and classrooms do to get good behaviour? And I thought this was a wonderful question, and it was a real labour of love for me. I spent a year going up and down the UK looking at primary schools, junior schools, elementary schools, senior schools, high schools, all around the UK, schools in challenging areas, schools in rural areas and so on. So we weren't just looking at really privileged schools. We wanted to look particularly at schools with high levels of challenge. How do they get great behaviour? Do they have anything in common? And if so, is that something we could share? I mean, thank God they did have something in common. Otherwise, this would be a very short presentation. And what they had in common were, well, I'll tell you what they had in common, but lots and lots of things. I should also mention that the reason why I think behaviour is important is that good behaviour improves every outcome you could possibly imagine for school. Now, I don't know if it's an obvious thing to say, but I do have to make this argument quite a lot. A lot of people say, why are you focusing on behaviour? You know, why do you want to oppress children? Oppress children with your rules and your routines and so on. And the reason is this, is that if children exist in a chaotic environment, which is unsafe, which isn't calm, it doesn't have to be silent, it just has to be calm, then kids don't learn very well. Kids don't flourish particularly well. Kids aren't safe, they're not happy, their mental health is affected, their well-being is affected, their academic outcomes are affected. It's an enormous myth that children can flourish and succeed in environments which are chaotic and unsafe. And it sounds absurd to even say that. And yet sometimes people do make this argument to me. I would say that children knowing how to behave in a way which helps them to flourish is the key success factor for academic outcomes, well-being, and everything else that I mentioned there already. And by good behaviour, I don't just mean not sitting still and shutting up. You know, a good behaviour isn't just silent compliance. I mean, it can be at times, but it's much more than that. I mean, there are times when children need to be quiet. There's times when we need to be quiet and know how and when to do that. So it could be in a library or in a cinema or listening at a symposium. But there are also times when good behaviour means to speak, to be assertive, to speak up for oneself. Or like me now, talking to you. You know, it would be pretty bad behaviour of me not to speak right now. And knowing how to speak and how to select your words carefully is also good behaviour. Or to put it another way, good behaviour means the ability to select the behaviour you need for the moment you're in order to succeed morally in a moral community, which is very Aristotelian if you know your Aristotle. That's what good behaviour means. And I think sometimes these discussions about behaviour devolve quite quickly into, oh, you just mean compliance, you know, you just mean passivity, you just mean quiet. Sometimes it means these things and sometimes it doesn't. That's the point. William Glasser, father of choice theory, famously said that everything we do is behaviour. The way I'm talking to you is my behaviour. The way you're sitting is your behaviour. Every physical action, which is a reaction to your environment, is your behaviour. And in that context, it seems obvious that the child's ability to select the correct behaviour is fundamental to their success. So if you are interested in social justice, and my God, I hope you are, if you're interested in social mobility, if you're interested in literacy, if you're interested in democratic participation, if you're interested in citizenship or a million other things, behaviour is core to achieving that. So behaviour is not some subsidiary thing, which is a bolt-on or an add-on. So behaviour is key to a child's success and ultimately to our success, individually, as a community, and as a society. And the fact that it's been undervalued and undersold, internationally, may I just add, because like MC Hammer, I've been around the world, from London to the Bay. I've seen a lot of countries, and there's no country getting this right just now, including the UK, I might add. You know, we're doing our best, and we've made some changes, but a lot of countries don't get this right. And a lot of it boils down to the fact that behaviour management is very frequently not taught in teacher training, teacher induction, or teacher preparation. And it's very frequently not taught at an institutional level for leaders running institutions. And because of this glaring gap, this huge omission in the culture of how we train and teach our leaders and teachers, we find teachers and leaders reinventing the wheel every single year, every cohort, every time we get a new generation of teachers and leaders coming through. We can do a lot better than that. And through the studies and the research that I've done and investigated and collated myself, we found that we already know quite a lot about how good behaviour is achieved in challenging situations with real children in real life circumstances where we have finite resources. This is the only type of advice that matters. And what we found was this. In the least effective classrooms and schools, the main strategy was to react. to misbehaviour, was to wait for misbehaviour to occur and then respond to it. Now, I want to be quite clear. You must respond to misbehaviour. But if that's all that you do, then all you'll do is fix something once it's broken or fight a fire once it's lit, which you must do. But that can't be all that you do. This is akin to letting your car run out of petrol. Sorry, gas, my apologies. Before refilling it, or waiting for it to break down before fixing it. Of course, what would be more useful would be the second bullet point, the proactive approach. And this is what the most effective teachers and schools do. They proactively ask themselves something which sounds so simple, and yet it's profound. What behaviours do my children need to exhibit or perform in order to succeed? What do I need them to be able to do so they can do well? And then we teach those behaviours. Explicitly, consciously, front-loading them in our relationships with them as learners. Why? Because almost every behaviour that we want from a child, which will help them to succeed in a school, whether it be handing in a book report, waiting in a queue, scraping their tray in the lunch queue in the canteen, putting their hand up to ask or answer, whatever behaviour you want for them, all of these behaviours, they're not born with them. Children aren't born with these types of behaviour. I've got 2 small children at home just now, in fact, just a few doors away. And one of the things you find is they don't know anything when they're born. And they're lovely and they're exhausting and so on, but a lot of the effort we put into them is teaching them the behaviours they need in order to succeed. Whether it be something as simple as tying their shoelaces or blowing their nose or going to sleep, teaching them behaviour is key to the effective raising of a child. Because all of these behaviours are learned from their environment. Children are not born knowing these types of things, how to tie their shoelaces and so on. Of course they're not. It's not hard. It's not baked onto the DNA or their hard drives. They learn these things. And some children, when they're fortunate, come from learning-rich environments where they're taught loads of these basic social skills and habits, these behaviours, in other words, tying your shoelace, saying please and thank you, waiting your turn, sharing, cooperating, group work, speaking up for yourself, standing up for yourself. Some children don't get so much of that. And some children who come from abusive, neglectful, or extremely challenging environments get taught toxic habits and toxic responses to their environment. And we shouldn't blame them, because children don't invent themselves. They're the products of their environment. But because they are the products of their environment, they don't select who they're going to be. They don't select their own social skills. They are the products of their experiences up to that point. And a child who comes from an abusive environment may well develop antisocial or toxic habits, which might have developed to help them to cope with the environment they're in, like running away or fighting back or being rude or whatever. But it doesn't help them to thrive in institutional environments like school or social settings or interactions with other people. In other words, behaviour is learned. So that's kind of the good news and the bad news. And there's more good news, though. The good news is that if behaviour can be learned, then it can be taught. And it's up to educators and school communities, individually and collectively, to teach the behaviour that we need to see. Not because we are some kind of fascist tyrant dictators who oppress our children, but because we want them to succeed, because we love them. We love them and we want them to exceed us. And so we teach them these basic social habits and how we interact with one another and how to study and what to do when you're late and how not to be late and all these different social skills and behaviours and habits that we often take for granted. Why do we take it for granted? Because we're so good at it. And this is called the curse of expertise, the curse of knowledge, a well-observed phenomenon, which states that when you're very good at something, you forget how hard it is for somebody else. And why, excuse me, and why do we fall into this paradigm I've got on the board for you here? Why is it that so many teachers and leaders are reactive rather than proactive? It's normally because of very poor teacher training or teacher induction or leadership training and preparation and induction. Now, I've written lots of stuff for the UK government, so we started to roll that out here. Hopefully we'll see some success. But there's a long way to go. And on that basis then, through everything I've said, the reason why children misbehave is often because they don't know what we mean by good behaviour. So the very first thing we need to do as educators is to teach them really basic stuff that we often take for granted, like this is how we're going to walk down the corridors so we're all safe, so we're all happy, so we look after each other. This is how we're going to attend an assembly or a reward evening or a trip to the sports centre, or this is how we're going to enter or leave a classroom. We teach it explicitly because we mustn't take it for granted that somebody already has told them this. And we make sure that maybe a third of your class that aren't sure of the rules, the regulations, the norms and routines, make sure that they know what they should do. And this is an act of kindness. And we front load these instructions, followed up by habituation. Once you've taught them explicitly what they need to do in order to succeed, because you care about them, you then insist upon it over time. This is the daily, weekly, monthly, and annual system. This is something which has to be applied continuously. In other words, the teacher, the mentor, the teaching assistant, the principal, everybody, every adult that surrounds these children must constantly insist upon certain standards of behaviour, whether it be something as simple as walking on the left or bringing certain equipment or something like that. There must be constant reminders and constant pressure. This is what you need to do. As an act of kindness, to habituate children into doing it automatically without thinking too hard about it. Because once we have a habit, we can take a little bit of a breather in terms of constantly insisting upon it. And this is no more nefarious than the insistence that everybody drives on the same side of the road. You know, an insistence that we all follow certain protocols and certain routines by which we'll all get along with one another more efficiently and in a more collegiate way. And the third reason why children frequently don't behave in a school is often because they don't value the behaviour. In other words, they don't think the behaviour matters, or they think their behaviour is a better choice, which means that behaviour management will also always be an act of persuasion as well as compulsion. And you have to have both. You cannot simply persuade children to behave the way you want them to behave. At some point, you have to have boundary conditions of unacceptable behaviour and consequences for those boundaries. But notice this, you don't run a school based on sanctions. Sanctions, consequences, as part of that process, are your backstop. The core of behaviour management is teaching the behaviour you want to see. In the same way that if you want somebody to be a good driver, you teach them how to drive. You don't just punish, you don't just give someone a car on the highway code and say, don't break that. You don't just give someone a car and say, don't run into things. You say, here's a car, let me teach you how to drive. That's how you get really good behaviour on roads. And you have to have boundaries and laws and rules and regulations and parking fines and so on. But you don't get people to drive well just because of them. They are your backstop when people refuse to do the right thing. The main part of behaviour management is training people to do the right thing. If I want you to speak German, I don't say don't speak French. I say, here's how to speak German. Which leads me to the behaviour curriculum. We have to teach the behaviour we want to see. And every school needs to have a clear, explicit behaviour curriculum. They need to sit down and think, not just what do I not want them to do, which is important, but also what do I want them to do? How do I want them to behave on the school bus? How do I want them to behave when asked or when asked to answer a question? What do I want them to do? What's the protocol? And it's not up to me to tell you what behaviours you need. You work out for yourself as a school or as a community what the behaviours are that you need. I've seen schools be successful in lots of different ways. That's the beauty of it. There's no one Tom Bennett school, or indeed Paul Bennett school. No relation, weirdly enough. Or is there? We teach the behaviour that we need for the environment, the school that we're in, and that will vary from school to school. I mentioned already the curse of knowledge, which is that we often underestimate how hard it is for people to do things that we find easy. We are expert behaviours, and we often overestimate how good children are at doing things that we find easy, like being patient, like listening to somebody with a strong accent talk to you in a 40-minute webinar. You know, these things are hard, and we often take it for granted because we find it easy. We mustn't. We mustn't. Just because we read, for example, doesn't mean it's easy to teach reading. Now, I've written books. I mean, some of them are even quite good. Some of them are terrible. But when my children were younger, I tried to teach them to read. I realised I didn't know how to do it. It's almost as if it's a specialist skill. I mean, fancy that. I'm sure you'll hear from some experts later on to talk about that. So when you're teaching behaviour to children, teach it like you would teach anything else. Use pedagogy. Be clear. Use sequences and worked examples and recaps and check for understanding and all the other principles that you may have encountered in your pedagogical journey. And if you know Rosenshine's principles of instruction, a wonderful basis to root your pedagogy in. And how do we create these cultures in classrooms? How do we create this sense of this is what you should be doing? Well, there's normally three main methods. Two of them are proactive and one of them is reactive. Norms and routines followed by consequences. And social norms simply feeds into the idea that human beings are intensely social creatures. Our behaviour is enormously influenced by the presence of other people. When you walk into a library, you find it hard to be noisy. When you're sitting in a stadium and somebody, there's a Mexican wave that crashes over you, it's so hard not to just kind of to copy them. Or you're at a theatre and you see something, you see a play you really hated, or a musical, maybe it was We Will Rock You or something like that, and you think that was terrible, and then everyone starts clapping and you do too, because social pressure or social proof theory dictates that we often look to one another to see how should we behave. We're enormously influenced by other people, and this is a good thing and a bad thing for us in schools, because the bad thing is that kids will copy kids and staff will copy staff to see what's the norm around here? What do people do around here? How do I fit in? What can I get away with? What's allowed here? What's accepted? What's permitted? How do I fit in with people? And people tend to gravitate towards those norms. It's not magic. You don't have to copy it, but it's hard not to. But the good news is that we can use this to our own advantage by flooding students with normative messages of this is what good normal behaviour looks like at school. That you have to have really high discipline on this. That individuals and groups of staff need to constantly be sending out the same messages about, this is the side of the corridor we walk down, or this is the time, this is what late or early means in terms of the school bell or the school pips. You've got to be really clear about these things. You can't have consistency unless everybody knows what you're talking about. It's like philosophy. You have to first define your terms. Well, you define individually and collectively, what does good behaviour look like around here? And then stick to it. Now, leaders have got a huge role in this, a huge role, because you have to make sure that staff know what it is, are trained to use it, and are doing it. But that's another discussion, but that's the basis of it. That's the skeleton of it. If students believe it's normal to behave in a certain way, they're much more likely to do it. It doesn't mean they'll all do it, but a lot of them will. And they think misbehaviour is normal if they see it, if it gets approval from other students, or staff don't do anything about it. What we permit, we promote. So you've got to be very consistent in your responses. Don't let things slide. Don't walk past stuff. Don't be strict one day and relax the other. Be the same person. Be reliable. Be trustworthy. And we build these norms by telling them all the time. But preferably, there should be a great big front-loading experience at the beginning of your relationship to really clearly say, hi, welcome to the school. We care about you. We want you to succeed, so we're going to behave like this. You frame it like that as an act of persuasion, rather than just saying, these are the rules. Or worse, not even telling them the rules and simply sanctioning them when they break them. This is the very worst way to teach behaviour. So use normative messages, demonstrate the behaviour, use other children as role models to say, that was fantastic, look what she or he is doing. Keep your expectations high and constantly challenge it when norms aren't met. The second aspect are routines, and routines are simply another form of a norm, but a routine is normally a sequence of behaviours that you want to be automatic. It's much more specific, it's much more crunchy. A norm might be kind. A routine might be, this is how you enter the canteen area, this is how you enter the dining area, this is what you do when you finish your food, and so on. And the beauty of this, again, is that you select the routines that you need for your environment. You've got to be conscious about it. Probably things like how they come in and leave the room, how they transition between activities, assemblies, drills, registrations, and inspections, whatever. You select it. You can teach children routines for what to do when there's an occasional or a supply teacher teaching the class. You can teach children routines for what to do when they're sad or sick, or they're finished, or they're stuck, or they don't have the right equipment. You can teach these routines because it makes them more powerful, it makes them more independent. But if you don't teach it, they won't know how to do it. So you identify the routines that you need when you notice the behaviour you don't want. Teach the opposite. Teach what you want. Transmit it or teach it, and then get them to practice it. Practice, pedagogically, is at the heart of learning. Practice, practice, practice. It's constant retrieval, which embeds it in our long-term memories. Practice is at the heart of any learning. It's one of the most substantiated things that we know to do. And you've got to practice it as best as you can. If you practice it badly, they get better at it badly, if that makes sense. And then finally, behaviour feedback. Once students have behaved in a certain way, they need to be immersed in feedback about how well they're doing. And again, this reflects back on one of the most substantiated pieces of the science of learning, which is simply formative assessment or assessment for learning. Professor Dylan William, of course, is one of the masters of this. The idea that if you want to really accelerate a child's learning, one of the lowest cost, most high impact things you can do is to give them high quality feedback about what they've just done. So you get kids to do an exercise, you observe it, and you give them feedback. Here's how to improve, here's what you got wrong, and so on. Most teachers do this all the time, but a lot of teachers don't do it consciously or consciously enough. It's something that needs to be part of your everyday process, and also part of the behavioural process. Once students have behaved in a certain way, they need to be immersed in feedback about how to do things. Did they do it right? Could they do it better? And this is where we get things like clarifications, or maybe some kind of support is required, or maybe some kind of reteaching is required, because a behaviour curriculum is centred on pedagogy. Maybe they need to be retaught the behaviour until they get it right. Maybe they need a nudge, a reminder. Maybe you just need to tap their desk or eyeball them for a few seconds. These little interpersonal tips and tricks are very, very useful for nudging students back onto the straight and narrow without having to resort to formal sanctions and cautions and so on. Or maybe you do need to use sanctions and rewards. And may I just say that I think you do have to have a system of sanction and reward, because most people will do the right thing because it's the right thing to do if you teach it well enough and you persuade them why it's the right thing to do, because most children like to feel successful. But you will still get a percentage of children who, despite knowing what to do, will choose not to do it. And in those circumstances, that's when you have to have boundaries of acceptable behaviour, and those boundaries have to be patrolled by sanction systems. Not overly punitive, just low-level, mild, consistent deterrents. Small things like, detentions and keeping them back after the break and little things like that. But they must be as consistent as possible, because the deterrence effect is magnified by its predictability, like a speed camera on a highway. The speed camera slows people down, but it doesn't slow everyone down. It slows most people down. And it doesn't slow them down forever. It slows them down for a short period of time. But that doesn't mean it's failed. It's slowed down a lot of people for a short period of time. That's its job. Job done. Its job isn't to solve all speeding. Its job is to reduce speeding. And that's what sanctions do in a school. They reduce the frequency and the severity of misbehaviour. They don't solve all behaviour. You cannot solve misbehaviour just by using sanctions. You can't solve all misbehaviour by rewards, because these are short-term behavioural modifiers. You use them as the backstop to the pedagogical process of teaching the behaviour curriculum. And finally, in the 5 minutes, I think I've got 5 or 10 minutes left to me. I'm going to exploit that as much as I can. I want to very quickly, this is a bonus level for you here. I'm going to very quickly go through what I consider to be some of the most prevalent behavioural myths in education, because research ed is all about enabling educators to access evidence-informed education, which isn't to say that everything must be based on a research paper, but where there's evidence, we should lean into it and interrogate it with our own practice, because where practice and academia intersect that's where the magic happens. That's the sweet spot. That's what we're looking for here. We're not asking academics to tell us how to teach. We're not asking teachers to tell academics how to research. We're asking for a dialogue between these two processes. And what I've worked out with research ed, and what animated me all those years ago to start research ed when I was a teacher, was that so much of what we did was what I call Frankenscience, folk teaching. We do it because it seems magic. Things which aren't even wrong, like brain gym and learning styles and NLP and thinking hats. There's no evidence basis behind these things whatsoever. And they were sold to us as transformative. We were conned, in other words. I call it Frankenscience and folk teaching. There's another category of myth, though, and it's called fetish pedagogy, or I call it that. And it's not as exciting as it sounds. I apologize. I know it's early for you. A fetish is when you attribute a magical power to an inanimate object. That's what a fetish is. And then psychology obviously borrowed it. And we see a lot of this in education. We see lots of educational fetishes when there are things which actually do work sometimes and are quite useful sometimes, but we somehow magically attribute them mystical properties as if they could solve everything. And in that category, you'll see things which are sometimes very useful: group work and project-based learning, and the flipped classroom, the blended classroom, and the inquiry learning, and so on. These things are all very useful at certain times and occasions. But when we fetishize them and say this is the way we must do everything, then we've sacrificed reason on the altar of fetish pedagogy. And we've got to be really careful about this and noticing these two different levels of what I would call kind of junky science. And we find this also in behaviour as well. And I'd like to refer you to a quote from one of my heroes, Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, who famously said that what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. And I love that, because when it comes to the field of behaviour management, and I read a lot about this, I assure you, I see a lot of assertions made about behaviour which are asserted without any evidence whatsoever, but have been adopted almost as dogma, as almost like the catechisms of the Catholic Church, that people just aren't allowed to question them. But when you poke them for 1 second, you find that there's not a drop of evidence behind them. And I'm going to quickly run through them. I don't have time to go through all the slides here. All behaviour is an unmet need. All misbehaviour is an unmet need. This obviously comes from people like Maslow and so on. There is no evidence to suggest this whatsoever. Some behaviours may come about as a result of an unmet need, but all misbehaviour, every time a child throws a pen at somebody, there's some need that's not being met. Do we have to meet this need? Perhaps the child needs to improve their behaviour. So I think that's a paradigm. It's not that behaviour doesn't have causes and that some of these causes aren't stemming from difficulties in their lives. Of course, some of them are, but not all of them. When I speed in the motorway, is there some unmet need that somebody else has to meet for me? Does everyone else have to get out of the way? No. And we cannot insist that teachers are amateur psychologists. The second one is that all behaviour is communication. I mean, all behaviour, again, it's one of these things which you often hear, and it seems to imply that teachers should spend their time stroking their chins working out, what do children really mean? In my very first lesson, a child was dealing drugs at the back of the classroom. Right? So that was a great introduction. And when I asked him to stop dealing drugs, he told me to F off. Now, what was he communicating there? I think I know. I think I've got a pretty clear idea. And the thing, my problem with this is that if all behaviour is communication, I mean, you can say everything is communication in that sense that you can learn something from it. Yeah, that's true. But it seems trivially true. And that it typically is used to imply it's a cry for help. But what if their behaviour is pretty much the face value of what it is they're trying to tell you? You mustn't try to turn teachers into amateur psychologists as if we need to work out what's really going on in their heads. We can barely do that with ourselves and our best friends. Or the myth that children naturally want to learn. I mean, have you ever met a child? I mean, they're quite curious, but they're not always curious about what you want to teach them. And very frequently, I want children to learn stuff that they initially don't want to learn because it's hard. And I want children to relish that eventually and look back and say, oh, that was worth it. But it's not going to be easy. We can't just teach children that they only have to learn when things are pleasant. Or behaviour management is all about relationships. Again, it's one of those things that it seems to put the cart before the horse. It's not completely untrue, but it doesn't help us very much because it's maddeningly vague. If you say to a new recruit, a new teacher, build a relationship with these children, they've no idea how to do it. And when they ask how to do it, you say, you'll work it out by yourself. That's a terrible way to train people. Let's not train airline pilots like this. It's true that in really high-functioning classrooms, you see great relationships, but the great relationship is a product of the processes, not the process itself. You don't walk up to someone in the street and say, we are compatible, we must marry. You know, that's not how you build a relationship. It's built over time by being trustworthy, which means structured, which means predictable. Myth number 5, they would behave if your lessons were worth behaving for. Now, this is normally said by the very worst of people. You can hit them with a frying pan if they say this. Is that, you know, students aren't often the best judge of a lesson's value. And if you're endlessly chasing their approval, then you'll end up not teaching them anything. Or they would behave if your lessons were relevant. I want my lessons to be irrelevant to them. I want to bring the world into their world. I want to bring the universe into their experience. I want to introduce them to things which aren't immediately relevant to them. I want them to find things which make sense to them and help them to make sense of their own lives by bringing in the lives of other people who've gone before them. And that won't always seem relevant. Not at first. Not at first. And then myth number 7, never use sanctions. Now, I hope I've made it clear that I don't think sanctions are the core of behaviour management. I know some people do seem to think that. I think sanctions are the backstop of behaviour management. I think that without sanctions, some children think they can do as they please, which is why we must have them. I have never seen a challenging school with a challenging demographic succeed with its cohort without some form of consequence boundary sanction system. It doesn't mean you lean into it all the time. In fact, the beauty of it is the more consistently you use it alongside pastoral interventions, the less you have to use it. And in the best schools with the most challenging cohorts, you hardly ever see it being used, but you do see it being used. And pretending, oh, we must never use sanctions is a surefire way of teaching some children you can do as you please. And there's a bonus myth which I'm going to introduce to you, which is trauma-informed practice. I want to be quite clear here. Trauma is real. The effects of trauma are very real and devastating. There are some children in our schools who are dealing with so much trauma in their life that they can barely focus on what they're doing in a classroom. And we should be sensitive to that, and we should invoke boutique and personalised pastoral responses for that. But the idea, and this is where I want to try to explode a myth, the idea that misbehaviour is always because of some kind of trauma in a child's life is nonsense. There is no evidence for this whatsoever. Human beings are naturally a wee bit selfish sometimes, or if they're bored, they'll do something to amuse themselves and so on. This doesn't mean they're broken. It means they're human, and children more so. And we shouldn't simply attribute to mental ill health a misbehaviour. The idea that we must always treat misbehaviour as something of trauma. It also is maddeningly unhelpful to children who are experiencing genuine trauma if you treat everything as a trauma, because then you divert attention and resources and focus away from children who really need the support to everybody, and that's not fair on them. And the word trauma itself, I mean, it used to initially mean head wounds in war, and then it drifted to include exceptional life events like divorce and witnessing death and so on, and then it drifted to when people are upset. So trauma has enjoyed a definitional drift over the decades that I think hasn't been helpful. And bringing trauma-informed practice into schools, it means almost everything and therefore nothing. We have to be very, 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 very careful how we use this term trauma-informed practice. Or to put it another way, working with children who've been affected by trauma is often very similar to how you should work with children in general, i.e. create a safe environment, a calm environment, where everybody is treated with dignity. Those 3 things are core to the culture of an effective school and effective classroom. It's not easy to create, but those are the things we need to cleave to, and we need to believe that it's worth it, because the difference it makes to children's lives, particularly children from disadvantaged circumstances, is enormous. The things I advocate, and these methods and principles and strategies, are not about sifting out the ones who can flourish. It's about making sure that everyone flourishes. And in the truest sense of the word, making sure that no child is left behind. Now, speaking of leaving you behind, I am right up to time here just now. I would love to hear from you. I am delighted you've chosen to attend today. Thank you so much for giving me your Saturday. You must be mad. I hope that's made sense. And if you want to ask any questions or follow up, please do feel free to do so.